this topic came up because of myself and other comrades kind of asking other members of the group how the Democommunists feel about direct action, which is a very vague question and it has a very nuanced answer. So my best attempt at explaining that is going to be as follows. So direct action, I've defined as an act of an individual or a group intended to bring attention to, demand, or force change within or upon an establishment by means that rejects the procedural methods sanctioned by that establishment. And I've kind of tried to break down the presentation into these general categories of direct action groups, or groups that might partake in direct action, and kind of give general outlines of how or where the Communist Project would fall in some of these like approaches to direct action. So the most obvious and like worst example of direct action would be reactionary action. This obvious example is from the January 6th attempted coup upon the Capitol, where Trump supporters disputed the election results and tried to take the Capitol by storm and put Trump in place as president, which is an interesting tactic. It was a large undertaking that was orchestrated like pretty nationally across several networks that were able to organize themselves online. But again, their biggest demand was simply keeping Trump as president, and nothing more than that, really. Nothing against the electoral system other than it being fraudulent, which is kind of an interesting take, because there are issues with electoralism that we obviously have. These people just think that it's all about voting machines getting scammed and stuff, which it's obviously not. The reason this is called reactionary action is because although it broke the conventions of the political establishment to achieve a desired result, the desired result itself did not challenge that establishment. So in essence, it was simply reactionary. These people weren't asking for a revolution. They just wanted Trump to continue his presidency. The reason this is reactive is because, or one of the many reasons this is reactive, is because the same group would have demanded hellfire among liberals if this same approach had been taken to, say, hold a coup that would have put Hillary Clinton in place instead of Donald Trump during the 2016 election. Despite all these weird motivators for what's happening during this direct action, it was relatively effective as far as like pulling the strings to make it happen. And it was wildly effective as propaganda because it remained in the media for weeks on end, although again, since it wasn't really challenging the establishment or electoralism or capitalism in general, it was kind of playing along with that system, and therefore there weren't any major challenges pushing against it. It actually played into a lot of the like natural way of like the political carnival in US electoralism, as far as like getting two different sides riled up at each other. There was, however, a huge notable fallout from this direct action, and that being that it kind of became a rallying cry for both Democrats and Republicans to increase police budgets nationwide. not even a year after the George Floyd rebellions had occurred and demanded and brought about in some places actual defunding of police. And although that was not nearly as expansive as it should have been, it was a small victory in demilitarizing the state, but then was quickly reversed by the actions of all these Trump supporters. And this is just evidence that the ruling class will try to reprimand challengers and try to remove valuable tools to revolution with authoritarian legislation, usually after direct action is taken and usually after it's failed in its objectives. These reprimandations come in the form of anti-protest laws or like the introduction of more anti-protest laws. I'm just going to dive into those for a quick second. The like right to protest is technically protected under the Constitution. To use public forums for protests, meaning streets, sidewalks, and public parks. In reality, under Colorado state law, for protests or like Colorado legislation that actually inhibits the practice of this right to protest are first and foremost permits, which are required for parades, marches, or anything taking place in the streets and not sidewalks. Also for organizations meeting in designated parks or for actions requiring sound amplifying equipment. So even including megaphones, yeah, like pretty much any action that the Democrat communists have participated in or like organized ourselves go against these laws. So they're definitely not like things that we should be afraid of. It's just legal grounds for the state to actually fight against these actions is by creating this legislation. More anti-protest laws in Colorado include engaging in a riot, which is defined by a group of 3 or more individuals engaged in violent conduct, creating grave danger or damage to property or people. Property is listed first in that statement. Also, this includes the obstructing of a government function. So like, I don't know, an occupation in front of the Capitol that would prevent people from entering and exiting, that counts as a riot, right? Also, engaging in a riot includes disobeying a public safety order, meaning like if police give you an order to disperse from the street and you disobey, even if you're sitting there peacefully and like abiding any other laws, if you're told or if you are given a public safety order in order to disperse and you don't comply, you can be charged with engaging in a riot in that sense. And the final anti-protest law in Colorado would be the obstruction of a highway, which also includes streets, sidewalks, railways, waterways, entrances or exits, aisles, stairways, or hallways, like anywhere that you could obstruct. If you're doing it for a political reason or a protest reason, it can be used to arrest you and press charges. So moving forward past that, one of these kind of groups that participates in direct action are called or referred to as self-organized groups. So I'll be referring to these actions that these groups take as self-organized actions. So unfortunately, the majority of people fall into this category, which I think is kind of a desired side effect of the capitalist state. and the result of people feeling resourceless and alone in the face of oppression or climate change or any of these other issues that we're trying to take direct action against. Unfortunately, many of these people still refrain from working with others or an organization towards action, instead seeking more immediate individual means of action or like satisfying that need to make a change. This often includes environmental activists, performance artists, the lone agitator, and many, many other kind of motivated peoples. This is also a typical descriptor for anarchists claiming to operate without leadership or policy. And I'll kind of go more into that later. So the first of these self-organized action takers is who I call the lone agitator. Most of these people are younger people feeling radicalized by their own lived experience under capitalism, and feel a need to maybe break out or act out without really having the education or discourse or resources to organize it or direct it. Their actions typically aren't, or they don't communicate as politically motivated, but they can have resounding effects, especially as propaganda. Particularly graffiti is a great thing that individuals can partake in that kind of can have a lasting effect as far as a direct action, while it still only remains one person. An example that I've used here was taken by one of our own comrades of a local graffiti artist letting bypassers know that the owner of this fine establishment is probably guilty of some sexual assault or rape allegations, and they took it upon themselves to scribble that all over the side of their building and kind of pass the word along like that, which is pretty effective. It can appear reactionary, but in the sense of like making an actual change and bringing certain issues to light, it can be fairly effective. A poor example of the lone agitator or like this kind of vandalism as propaganda example would be Patriot Front. They also like beat paste and spray paint weird little propaganda shit all over the place, but it's I mean, it's fascist in motivation basically, but they are using it as propaganda. So graffiti vandalism typically is what the lone agitator goes for. There are other approaches besides vandalism, though most of them do involve vandalism. A lot of self-organized action takers tend to be environmentally motivated or environmental activists. It tends to come as a result of a lived experience by all people. Like we're all seeing increased temperatures. We're all seeing like flooding, all seeing like extreme weather patterns taking place. So they're not necessarily radicalized outside of just their own lived experience. And that's kind of why these tend to be self-motivated actions. But these numbers are growing at this point in time, but I think it's important to recognize that the organization of these people needs to be growing along with that to harness the potential of these masses that are becoming more and more radicalized. As stated here, that the worsening effects of global warming are pushing environmentalists to act hastily with smaller numbers with diminishing effect. An example here being Just Stop Oil and an Extinction Rebellion, blocking oil terminals or blocking some oil tankers from getting to some oil terminals. That happened this past April. And while they managed to hold up that aspect of the oil industry for several hours, they ultimately didn't achieve much other than getting this little bit of propaganda into small like leftist publications and maybe some like local news coverage. But ultimately it didn't stop oil from being added to these terminals. And I mentioned here the diminishing effect of these protests is not because of the protests themselves, but instead just the fact that oil and fossil fuels and capitalism in general are continuing on outside of the small disruption that this action prompted. All right. This is not always the case, though. You can get some progress made with some smaller numbers. Earlier this year in 2022, some British activists broke onto the tarmac of Heathrow Airport in London and stopped the deportation of over 60 people, who many of which are still living in London, because there was no plan of action if a whole bunch of people prevented the plane from taking these people out of the country. So instead, they were just allowed off the plane and allowed to go back home, and there's been no follow-up with that. So that was a successful action with smaller numbers. Here's another example of an environmental direct action done by the same group, Extinction Rebellion, where they and I think 25 different scientists went to this building, the Department for Business, Energy, and Industrial Strategy, which is a part of the UK legislation or political sphere. It's not a US government institution. Extinction Rebellion exists in the UK. But they had 25 of these scientists go and glue their hands and scientific papers to the windows of this building in an attempt to, as a legal observer put it, to draw the attention of the Department for Business to the issues, to remind them of what the science is. This had a whole lot of support from just other local activists, like just the population of London. One person there was there as a mother, quoted saying, "I'm here as a mother doing the only thing I feel that I can do. I'm now taking direct action out of a place of desperation," not really knowing what else she can do, because what else can she do for her children? And I think that kind of displays this sense of unchanneled or like undirected anger or radicalization that can't like co-opted into our movement, but on this level is it's not really pushing towards any sort of organization. It's a lot of mass demonstration and disruption, which is what XR or Extinction's Rebellion's week of action this past April was kind of all about. It was calling on the general population to come out for disruptive marches, to come out and glue your hands to these buildings. Actually, at the same time of day that all these scientists were at the Business, Energy, and Industrial Strategy building, large protests had just ended at the outside of the offices for the executives for Shell Oil in the UK. And many of those people were breaking into that office, gluing themselves to those desks, and demanding to speak with, I believe, the chair for Shell's operations in the UK. None of which they got, but those were the demands, were to have a meeting with this orchestrator of Shell Oil in the UK. The response of a spokesperson from this building, the Department for Business, Energy, and Industrial Strategy, was that while they are gradually driving down the need for oil and fossil fuel consumption, we can't have a cliff edge hanging overnight, or a cliff edge hang by shutting oil off overnight, which is true. We can't like just stop using oil tomorrow and expect everybody's life to continue okay. We need to have like way more fights for like improved public transit. We need to have more fights going to reduce plastic waste. We need to have more fights going in society as a whole, that's so dependent on fossil fuels. We need to have fights going in all of those avenues in order to be able to like actually switch and move away from fossil fuels. So while the spokesperson's statement was defending the economy and people's jobs, they are not entirely wrong in the sense that we can't just shut off oil use overnight and expect everything to be okay. There do need to be like organized steps to get society away from its dependence on oil. And we believe that's through socialist organization. The reason that I kind of brought up direct action to begin with is because of this book. I haven't read it, but I've listened to podcasts with the author of it. But this book argues that climate urgency calls for the sabotage to private property as a means of fighting fossil fuels, which is a really good intent, I've come to understand, but ultimately that's creating a lot of oil spills, like to go around and try to single-handedly blow up oil. Even if you were successful in that, oil is constantly expanding. So shutting down one station isn't going to stop 20 more from popping up. Even if it did, that's not generating a path forward to move away from oil, and in turn creating a whole lot of like economic or environmental destruction in itself by like blowing up pipelines, which are leaky as fuck anyways, which are part of the whole environmental issue with them to start. So here I just kind of summarized that seeking to end fossil fuel production without seeking to replace the capitalist system that perpetuates it is reactionary more than revolutionary, despite the intent being radical. This approach wrongfully assumes the capitalists will not try to defend their source of capital when it comes under attack, but would it instead willingly surrender their empire to serve the good of all. In this way, the goal is not revolutionary, but reform. Next, I'm going to kind of jump into a different sect of direct action takers. I'm referring to them as non-governed or self-reliant groups. Another term could be anarchists, and I don't want to hang out on that word too much because I don't want to talk down anarchist theory without knowing a whole lot of it myself. I'm just going to outline some distinctions between a Marxist approach to direct action and an anarchist approach to direct action. Reclaim the Streets was a anarchist organization in the UK around the turn of the millennium. I don't think it's around anymore. But their statement was that you reclaim the streets as a non-hierarchical, spontaneous, and self-organized. We have no leaders, no committee, no board of directors, no spokespeople. There is no centralized unit for decision-making, strategic planning, and production of ideology. There is no membership and no formalized commitment. There is no master plan and no predefined agenda. While that's, not really all well and good in reality, because the reality is to flaunt such a disarray and a disregard for the organized, like, maliciousness and the systematic evil that is capitalism, to think that you can even step to that sort of like organization and bring it down without having any sort of organization yourself is wholly irresponsible, which is why Marxists tend to have different desired outcomes or different methods and desired outcomes for direct action. So I kind of call this the chess and checkers approach. Anarchists claim to operate without leadership or policy, but the level of their organized mass actions are evidence of a system of leadership to make key decisions, as in what, where, when, how, and why of each action, essentially, and as well as a top-down policy of compliance by the rank and file. This sort of non-democratic approach to action is problematic among Marxists as it's simply non-democratic. It creates a key committee for making decisions that pushes these decisions downward into the rank and file, and there's no way for the rank and file to push their agenda or what they think should be done up to this key committee. And you see this kind of with the groups that perform action in black bloc, where everybody's identity is like hidden and they are all given a plan to follow prior and everybody has to stick to the plan. And if anybody divulges from the plan, then all hell is going to break loose, which just is not really a fair way to go about things. These actions vary from disruptive protest to mutual aid campaigns, typically focusing on seceding from the capitalist state until it's dissolved by force or magically disappears, leaving us in a self-reliant hunter-gatherer type of society lacking governance of any kind. Mutual aid is great, but under capitalist hoarding of resources, we are essentially pushing crumbs around to share, as I've heard it described by a fellow comrade. And that's simply acknowledging that if we don't reclaim the resources that are being withheld from us by this class society and the capitalist like redirecting of resources for profit, we're essentially going to end up with nothing, and there won't be anything to share or mutually aid each other with. So while it's good in the shorthand, it can't be seen as a like a long-term solution to capitalism or a alternative to socialism. The abolition of the state is something that both anarchists and communists see as an objective that needs to happen. There is a bit of a divide between the two ideologies as far as why that abolition needs to happen. So sorry, just a moment. So, my bad, I lost my place. I'm going to jump into the statement that was given at an anarchist convention in 1872 regarding kind of the actions of the proletariat during direct action. So the aspirations of the proletariat can have no other aim than the creation of an absolutely free economic organization and federation based on work equality, wholly based on work and equality, wholly independent of any political government, and such organization. Oh my goodness, I'm sorry. The aspirations of the proletariat can have no other aim than the creation of an absolutely free economic organization and federation based on work and equality, wholly independent of any political government. And such an organization can only come from the spontaneous action of the proletariat. No political organization can be anything but the organization of rule in the interest of a class and a detriment to the masses. The proletariat, should it seize power, would become a ruling and exploiting class. That again was a statement made by the anarchist convention in 1872, a response to which I have given by Trotsky, quote, "To renounce the conquest of power is voluntarily to leave the power with those who wield it, the exploiters. The essence of every revolution consisted and consists of putting a new class in power, thus enabling it to realize its own program in life. It is impossible to wage war and to reject victory. It is impossible to lead the masses towards insurrection without preparing for the conquest of power." Marx also advocated for the abolition of the state, but unlike anarchists, he saw a means for an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all, a self-governing people. The task of this new state would be to develop the economy to eradicate want, where less need becomes the less of a need to govern the people. Under this theory, the class, society, and state will wither away as government of the people, or the rule of class over another, is replaced by the administration of things, the planned and organized use of resources to meet society's needs. And this approach alludes to land stewardship and resource conservation and other indigenous approaches to societal systems that are sustainable and synchronous with our environment. That's to say, international socialism is the solution to, or international socialism is decolonizing and is the solution to global warming. This was a really kind of big undertaking that I didn't fully expect to have so many like avenues to dive into and be so much information to condense. So I threw together these loose guides for direct action, kind of based loosely on what I've learned through my research here. That being that mass democratic, or that direct action should involve the masses, it should be democratic, and it should be conscious. That's to say, action should be thought and planned out with clear aims and objectives if it is to succeed. Repercussions of failure should be considered. The potential losses to revolutionary ability ideally should not be heavily outweighed by the desired gains. However, the finish line of struggle must not be placed at the downfall of capitalism, but at the establishment of a new form of society, socialism. Also, the biggest problem I identified with direct action is that there's simply not enough of it. Mass movements, momentum, and militancy are most effective when orchestrated in tandem with one another towards a clear objective. Disruptive protests and mass action work best in tandem when organized with workers' actions and vice versa. For example, strikes, occupations, basically organization within an industry as well as organization from the mass outside of an industry is the only way that we could truly bring an industry under the control of the masses or the proletariat working it, and actually like create change through those direct actions. Like I said, it was a big undertaking, bigger than I thought it was going to be. I hope this is a good kickoff because I think a lot of the juice is going to come in the conversation and discussion. I hope I sparked a lot of questions in some of the new faces that we have here. But I guess I'll just end on this note that the ideas of Marxism are not the subject of academic study, but they are precisely a guide to action.